Greetings, retro lover. This is Ethan, aka the Ghost Mall, back with you once again from my home studio here. And what I thought I'd do today is actually share with you what I hope will maybe be the beginning of a new series on retrowave tools, retrowave instruments. Basically, I have a love and sort of a passion for the equipment and the gear and the instrumentation that gave 80s music and early 90s music, the period of time and styles that I focus on with the Ghost Mall, the types of instruments that gave that music its character, its unique character and vibe. And when synthesizers and drum machines came into vogue in the 80s, they revolutionized all forms of music, not just pop music, but also film soundtrack music, which is another area I like to explore with the Ghost Mall, and pretty much everything that you could hear on the radio or TV or in films utilize this new technology in some way. And so when we think back, and we have those nostalgic episodes for those retro times, a lot of what I think is embedded in our brains, at least I'll speak for myself, is the sound of that kit, that equipment. And so what I want to do today is profile what may be, the first of many, if you all are interested in this, pieces of gear. And I'm going to start with something from Korg. It was the Korg PolySix synthesizer. Let me just pull up a photo of that. You should be able to see that now. Here it is in its natural environment, the Korg PolySix. And it was introduced in 1981. It's a 6-voice analog synthesizer, one of the first sort of affordable ones. And now it's available to music producers like myself and maybe like you. If that's one of the things you do is retro music production, it's available as a VST instrument for computer, digital music production. But before I talk a little bit more about what the PolySix is and why it's special and a bit of its history, I went ahead and made a little bit of a track just using a handful of Korg PolySix sounds from the VST version here. It looks like this, and I'll show you more of the interface later. But let me just play you back this little track that I composed today to highlight a couple of the sounds. It's got a handful of just like 4 sounds from the Korg PolySix. The only thing that's not from the PolySix are these drums, which are from an Alesis HR16 drum machine. This is actually a bit of a New Jack Swing style track, which is not contemporaneous to when the PolySix was introduced in 1981, but it's still retro, and it was what I felt like coming up with today. So let me play you back this track so you can hear a little bit of the PolySix in action, and then we'll break it down a little bit further. Here we go. All right, there you have it. Just a little bit of a 8-bar loop using some of those Korg PolySix sounds for your enjoyment in a new jack swing kind of a style. And what you can really hear is that it was a true analog machine, classic analog machine. So let me just go ahead and I'm going to tell you a little bit more about the PolySix, and then sort of the role it's played in some of my productions maybe, and then I'm going to let you hear several more examples. I'll show you the interface and whatnot. But let me take you back to a little view of the PolySix here so I can tell you a little bit more about it. So like I said, the Korg PolySix was introduced in 1981, and that's around the same time as the Roland Juno 6. If you're familiar with that at all, they were kind of competitors, if you will. The three major Japanese synthesizer manufacturers of the time, Korg, Yamaha, and Roland, were always trying to one-up each other. There was a lot of brinksmanship in the synthesizer world, and a lot of great engineering. And I think it's a bit sad today that when we look back on those times, because some of the Yamaha and Roland synths like the DX7 or the Juno 60 or the Jupiter 8 are so iconic that Korg is sometimes forgotten, even though they were doing equally impressive things. So yeah, the PolySix is a 6-voice analog synthesizer, and it has 3 oscillator waveforms available: a sawtooth, a variable pulse width, and a PWM. It had some effects, great sounding effects, chorus, phaser, and a unique ensemble effect, which was a kind of a major selling point. It had an arpeggiator. I'll actually show you all those things in a minute on the VST version on the interface. So it was a really full-featured, great-sounding 6-voice analog synthesizer, and it was one of the first that was relatively affordable. I mean, after the Oberheims and the Prophet 5s being sort of out of the reach of your everyday, musician, instruments like the PolySix were a breath of fresh air because they offered a lot of the similar sound and functionality to these more expensive synths, but they were sort of like the PolySix might be thought of as maybe like the mere mortals Prophet 5. So that's a little bit of the history on the PolySix, and at least back in the day when it was first introduced, and it was eclipsed by more full-featured instruments with maybe more voices and more options at a similar price point within just a few years. But for at least the early 80s, the first half of the 80s, the PolySix was definitely a popular option for people making, synth pop music or any kind of synth-based music. Let me take you back over to the DAW here, and I want to show you now how it's available to us in the modern digital era. This is the Korg PolySix VST from Korg. This is not, a third-party emulation, or certainly not a ripoff. This is part of Korg's Legacy collection, which is a VST bundle, which maybe if y'all are interested, leave me a comment and let me know if you'd like me to profile one or more of the other instruments in the collection. But basically Korg went back and tried their best to create digital versions, recreations of some of their most popular iconic synths from the 80s and the 90s, and the PolySix is among them. So yeah, let me just walk you through the interface here a little bit, and then I'll show you several more sound examples outside of the few that were in that track. I think that, let's see, where's a good place to start here? Oh, I should mention that if you are a music producer making, retrowave tunes, that this is definitely something you should consider getting. By itself, the PolySix VST is super affordable, really, for what it gives you. It's $50, I think, US. The whole Legacy Collection bundle is only $200 US. And those are VST versions, but there's also a rack extension version available for Reason, which is actually how I was first introduced to this. I got it for Reason first, used it in a handful of productions. It was one of the very first, if not the first, retro synthesizers that I bought when I was starting the Ghost Mall project back a couple of years ago. And to this day, I don't regret that decision, because it's an instrument which is, it has everything going for it for somebody wanting to make retrowave music. It's simple to use, it's versatile, you can create lots of different sounds with it, and it's very 80s. So you can get the rack extension version, that's also $50, or the VST version by itself for $50. There's even a version for iPad, which I think is like $30, and I can't speak to the quality of it or if it's similar or different from these versions, because I'm not an iPad user, but definitely check these out. So let me show you just a little bit more of the sounds here. Let me just make sure. I'm going to make sure my bus processing is off here. And in the song, we've got 4 instances of it here. This is the Fat Line Bass preset. Whoops. That's never good. My apologies for that. Let's try that again. Okay, that's more like it. Apologies for that noise. I might be taxing my, even though it's a thoroughly modern digital studio environment I'm working in here, might be putting a little bit too much pressure on the system here with both video capture and an audio program going on. But so the first example of a sound you hear in the song is this Fat Line Bass. That's just about the most iconic sound that you can get from the PolySix. It's the first preset in the first default sound bank. The actual hardware PolySix had, I think, 32 memory slots, and so that was another great feature for producers, musicians back in the day, that in 1981, to have, to be able to save like 32 patches and recall them at a moment's notice was a pretty awesome feature in an affordable synth. So, but a lot of retrowave producers now will open up the PolySix, and this is the first sound they hear. And they're going to be inspired by that, right? So actually, if you listen to a lot of popular retrowave tunes productions these days, I'm sure you've heard this sound before. I can think of 2 or 3 examples off the top of my head, and that's because it's so iconic. As a matter of fact, I use this for the bass line in my song Forget the Sunset. It has a really punchy 80s, instantly recognizable sound to it, and so it's pretty beloved. That's the first sound I used in this production. I have some processing going on here. I did do a little mix for you, so I've got some EQ and some compression and some saturation. But I'm going to play you some of the raw sounds from the synth in just a minute. Here's a synth comp. It's kind of a warm, chorusy analog sound. We've got a analog bell. And we got an analog clav sound, which I always love these. Yeah, the thing about analog synths was that there were some things they could do really well, like sort of those warm string sounds and those great, brass sounds that we love from analog synths. Even though they weren't realistic, they had a great character. Some things they couldn't do well, like analog synths were never good at mimicking like an acoustic piano, for example, and it wasn't until you got some digital synthesizers and then later high quality samplers or synths with PCM samples that we could have a quality piano sound in a synthesizer. But as far as keys go, a clavinet sound is something that analog synths really often could do pretty well. So this one from the PolySix sounds nice. So this little track just had a few examples in it, but let me give you a lot more examples here so you can hear more of what the PolySix was about. Let me just first of all show you, if you just initialize what you get. So this is the interface here. You can go to the main screen, and all these keys and knobs are fully functional here, but the GUI is pretty small, so if you want to really get into editing, there's the edit screen, which is much better. You got a config screen here with just some MIDI options and tuning. You can alter master tuning and stuff. Here's your program list. This is also where you load banks, and I'll show you some of that in a minute, and then you can write a program. But let me just walk you through the interface as it was on the original PolySix and the kind of sounds it could make. So up here you've got your oscillator waveform section. You've got a sawtooth. You have variable pulse width, which is like, a square wave that you can vary. If you're thinking to yourself, hey, that sounds a little bit like a Commodore 64 or an NES, you wouldn't be wrong, because in the NES in particular, you had variable pulse width for 2 or 3 of the voices, I think, out of the 4 or 5 voices, and so you could go from having a sort of thick, full square wave sound to something a lot thinner. And then the third oscillator is this PWM, which offers more with a modulation. Let's crank these up a bit so you can hear. There we go. And so you start to get a sense for the kinds of things you could create here. If you control click, you can reset any control here. Also, there is a sub oscillator, so you can add that an octave or 2 octaves below. Otherwise, you're just dealing with the one voice, one oscillator per voice here. Speaking of voices, down here you have your 6 voices. Although in the virtual era, we have the benefit of being able to increase that above what was really available on the hardware. So let's say you got 12 voices here. But let's take it back to the authentic 6 voices. And one way that you would create a thick sound back in the day, of course there are the effects section I'll get to with chorus and whatnot, but you could turn the unison up to 6 and take it out of poly mode, and now you've got a 6 voice lead sound. Really thick, sort of epic kind of sound there. If you wanted to, have 6 voices in poly mode, though, you have to take it back down and turn on poly. Now you can play some chords. Let's talk about the effects for a second, because that was another thing that really sold the PolySix. You have a chorus, sounds really nice, and you can alter the spread. So if I turn it down to 0, you're going to get a real mono sound in the middle. And if I turn the spread all the way up to 10, you got a nice but very natural stereo image going on there. Let's control click that. We also have a phaser. And let's turn up the intensity a bit. And it doesn't sound like a phaser like you might have had like in a small stone pedal or something, but it has its own quality. And then the ensemble was a really unique aspect of the PolySix effects. That's a really thick sound. Let's turn up the spread. Can almost get out of control if you really crank it. And then if you went back and thickened it up to 6 unison voices here. That's a pretty epic sound there. So, yeah, I mean, you also have, I'm going to just go back to another initialization patch here. So you can hear, you've got your, obviously you have your filter section here. And your envelope generator. Let's turn on the attack, for example. You can do all that great stuff that you would expect. It's also got a built-in arpeggiator. Now, I have an arpeggiator on my board here, so I can just turn that on at a moment's notice, but also within here you can turn this on. Got it synced to tempo. Let's see, 16 notes. Right now it's in a 1 octave up down pattern. Let's go 2 up, which I think is what I had on the board here. Nice. I can imagine that now you're starting to get a bit of like a Stranger Things possibility here. You get the picture. So it's great to have that available here. You can adjust the rate and what have you, of course. So yeah, so that's the interface on the PolySix here. And before I finish, let me just play you a bunch of the sounds so you can kind of decide for yourself whether this is something you're interested in if you're a producer, or if you're just a fan of this music, you can hear some more of these nostalgic vibes. Okay, so the VST version, the virtual version of the PolySix, comes with 3 banks of 32 sounds. You got a 0 sound here. Available to you. Of course, you can create your own sounds, save your own sounds. There are third-party sound designers who've created banks for this PolySix. But let me just play you through some of what's available here. I'm going to mute my mic so you can hear better. I won't go through everything here, but I'll kind of point out some of the ones that I like a lot. Nice funky sound there. You know me, I love these brass sounds, and this, of course, is, from the look of it, supposed to mimic, you know, some kind of like a, not a trumpet, you know, maybe a French horn. The resonant bell that we had in the track. Some pads here. Strings, again, just like the Juno series, because of its similarity to the Juno series, the PolySix was you know, known for string sounds. Let's see what we got here. That's lovely. Lots of nice modulation there. Got that clav again. Another pad. I didn't talk about the LFOs and stuff in here, but obviously you can do there are a lot of modulation possibilities. Some ARPs. You know, different patches have the mod wheel mapped to different functions, whether it's the filter or, you know, what have you. And actually, there are quite a few effects kinds of sounds in these banks. So let me load up, this is the default bank. Let me load up, they're going to be in your document files if you follow the default paths. So we've got 2 expansion banks. Let me open the first one for us. Yeah, I would call that a screwy synth. That's funny. This is a nice sound. I use this in the tune, the Go Small tune, My Heart's Refrain. Let's see what else we have here. There we got kind of a oscillating effect kind of a sound. Another ARP here, it looks like. It's a nice sound, kind of Moog-esque. A little bit of a organ kind of a feel there. All right, take us to the arcade. Nice. What else? Yeah, a real nice pad kind of sound. These bells. It's interesting, they have a resonance like a bell, but an attack very much unlike a bell. All right, and let's load up the last bank for a few more examples here. Expansion bank 2. 80s pop. There you go. That's all you need right there. That's a nice sound. Got some more brass. That's a unique one. Let's see, some leads. So on that mod wheel there is mapped to some pitch bend variability. Some nice funky sounds. Pop synth. That would sound good as an ARP. And some more strings. Very nice, very much in line with like a Juno. And you've already heard this one in the tune. That's nice. So yeah, there's a lot that can be done with this synth, and that's, like I said, one of the reasons that I really enjoy using it in the Go Smalls music. It's quite simple. You know, it's not like one of these synths that has multiple oscillators at the same time. It's a single oscillator per voice. So for me, I don't like to do sound design. I consider myself more of a songwriter, and I admire people who do sound design so much because it's the sounds they come up with which inspire me, you know, to get excited about writing this kind of music. Like, oh, that sounds so good. What a great bass sound, or what a great pad, and move on from there. So that's not to say that I'm not interested in sound design. I'm just never been really good at it. But something like the PolySix allows me to dig in and just turn the knobs and get sounds that are interesting to me really easily. So it's simple, but it's versatile. We've heard lots of different sounds, all that would be right at home in an 80s, you know, pop production. We've got the analog bells and the clav and the strings and the pads and the brass and the sound effects and, of course, the bass sounds. So simple, versatile, and so 80s. You know, for a synth that came out in 1981, you can bet that it was sort of ubiquitous in the period of time that I'm interested in mimicking. And if you like retrowave music, that you're probably interested in as well. So This has been a lot of fun to profile the Korg PolySix for these Retrowave tool. This hopefully what will be a Retrowave tools series. If you like this, please let me know. Or if you have thoughts about another instrument or piece of 80s kit, music making tech that you'd like me to profile and talk about, I'd be happy to do that. And otherwise, I'll just see you next time, and I'm going to play you out, I think, with a little snippet of the track here again. And it's been a lot of fun, and I look forward to seeing all you retro music loving kids again. Take care.